Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for this opportunity to have what I think is going to be a very interesting conversation. So, David, thanks very much for joining us. I don't know what to start with. Should I start by talking to you about Uber and the India experience, or should I talk to you about what's happening with the U.S. presidential race? Do you believe that the Iowa caucus was fixed, as is being alleged now by Donald Trump?
Well, let's start there. I guess I'm in the mood to deflect some craziness. No, thanks, Shereen, for being here, and USIBC for hosting us. No, I think we have an election going on here. You obviously, like America, it seems like there's always politics in the air here in India, and you've got elections all the time. Our system's a little bit different. Obviously, a presidential system, and we have a sequence of events to determine who are. We only have two parties in our country, although if this keeps up, maybe we'll have a third. People are getting somewhat distracted. But no, I think that you're beginning to see, my personal view is Donald Trump is not out of the race. He could win the New Hampshire primary, which happens next Tuesday, and if so, he'll be back in it. But he does not deal well with setbacks. And so obviously, I think he believed he was going to win the Iowa caucuses. He didn't. He's embarrassed. He's lashing out. I don't think it probably is helping him because people want solidity and strength and dealing with adversity in their president. And you know, when you're dealing with losing the Iowa caucuses, that's a pretty small thing in the scheme of things. And so to rant and rave and attack everyone is probably not terribly becoming. But he's got a big lead in New Hampshire. I think he'll lose it over the next 5 days, but it's big enough that he may hold on.
Is it a real possibility, Donald Trump?
I don't make predictions in politics, but I'm comfortable saying there's 0% chance he'll be the president. But there's probably a 30% chance he's the Republican nominee, which is hard to believe. You would have thought a year ago that was 0%.
Yeah, who would have thought?
But there's something real going on in America, and I think we see this all over the world. There's rising populism on the right and the left. So in the U.S., Trump is not a conservative, he's a populist. Bernie Sanders is a populist on the left side, doing better than people thought. So,
are you surprised by how well Bernie Sanders is doing?
Well, we'll see how well he's doing a month from now. I think that states like Florida, Texas, California will be much better for Secretary Clinton. But he's doing well, yeah. I think that there's more of a populist movement on the left than I would have guessed. I don't think that's helpful for governance because I think it makes it harder for elected officials to compromise. It makes it harder to be a centrist. But it's real. And I think it's not because of Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. They've tapped into it. We saw in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn winning the Labour leadership. Again, populism on the rise.
So as a Clinton supporter, are you worried?
No.
No?
Well, listen, if you're in politics, you worry about everything because we live in a world of big data and analytics, and you can almost with eerie perfection have some sense of what's going to happen. But politics surprises us, as does sports, all the time. So if a year and a half ago you went into a betting parlor and said, I'd like to bet that Donald Trump will be the front runner for the Republican nomination and that Bernie Sanders will be basically tied with Hillary Clinton, you could have gotten 1,000,000 to 1 odds. So no, I think she's going to win. I think she may lose New Hampshire, but I think it'll be closer than it looks now. But she'll win most of the rest of the states. And I think the big challenge for her is the Obama coalition is the Obama coalition. It's not a Democratic Party coalition. So it's got a lot of African-American voters, Latinos, Asian-American voters, young voters. And so Hillary Clinton needs to replicate that as much as she can. And I think the hardest part of that will be younger voters because Bernie Sanders is doing very well with younger voters. So I think if I were in the Clinton campaign, that's what I would be focused on like a laser is once we get the nomination, how do we rekindle some passion amongst younger voters?
So my last question to you about the U.S. presidential election before I talk to you about Uber and India. What's different, you think, this time around? You've been involved with the previous 2 presidential campaigns involving President Obama. What do you think is different about America and this presidential race?
Well, first of all, every election has its unique aspects. I think my theory on politics is elections often, in some respects, are a referendum on, but also a correction to the previous occupants. So for instance, Obama very different than Bush. Bush very different than Clinton. You can go all around the world and that tends to happen. So that's one of the reasons I think Trump's doing so well. He's about as different from a Barack Obama as you could imagine. And I think for Republican primary voters, they like that. So I think you have an incumbent in office. So some voters are going to look at this election through the prism of the incumbent. We obviously have a very tense situation around the world. I don't think that will be as important as the economy in the election, but it's a factor. People feeling concerned. I was in Europe a couple weeks ago, and the expression a couple of people used to me when I was in Brussels was, it's just a nervous continent. I don't think we're quite as nervous in the US, but there's an edge to that. And then we have an economy that has healed statistically, but the average person isn't feeling it. And so all those things, but I'd say from a campaign standpoint, the evolution of data and analytics will be even better than it was 4 years ago, or has the capacity to be. More and more people getting all their information from social networks. It's, in some ways, we know everybody's on Facebook, but it still makes it harder to run a campaign. So a lot of changes. And I think this growth in populism, you know, Mitt Romney was not a populist. Barack Obama not really a populist. Now you've got populism really, I think, being the defining characteristic of both of our elections. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that's a big difference.
Okay, let me now talk to you about Uber. Let me start by asking you about the rebranding efforts. At least if one goes by what social media is saying, hasn't gone down too well. This was an in-house effort on the part of Uber. I believe you didn't get a research agency to help you with this. Explain the strategic rationale behind this rebranding effort. And you know, when McDonald's opens in India, it's McDonald's. If Starbucks opens in India, it's Starbucks. The strategic way of addressing this market, the global strategy, varies from company to company. But why the decision to, at the front end, rebrand yourself in different countries?
Well, I think our CEO, Travis Kalanick, talked about this. When the company first started, it was a very exclusive product. It was only limousines, black cars. The colors, you know, very stark. And so I think that we are an interesting tech company because we have we're in the digital world, but it enables a lot of activity, economic and transportation activity in the physical world. And so all the economic activity, for instance, here in India, it's remarkable. Uber didn't exist in India a little more than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
250,000 people are driving the Uber platform. Think of that scale. There's no other private sector entity in this country that's created that kind of work in those 2 years. The same thing's true in the United States. The same thing's true in many countries. So our technology enables that powerful economic activity. So I think we wanted something that, so the logo type will be the same in every country. It's just there'll be some distinction on color, which I think both represents our view that we want to celebrate the cities and be partners where we operate, but also it more reflects our brand. We have now offerings at every price point. Now, there's been some colorful commentary about our app. Listen, in today's social media world, any company, you know, you could now put out the Nike swoosh and it would be criticized. So we knew that was going to happen, but we think in a week from now it really won't be a topic of debate. And a year from now, I think the logo will be something people identify very closely with the brand.
You were talking about the India experience and how you've seen this phenomenal growth over the past 2 years. It hasn't been an easy drive for you here in India. You've been, you've had to deal with all kinds of regulatory uncertainty, both at the central government level, at the state government level. You've had that unfortunate incident as well. What is the sales pitch now that Uber is making to the government? And I go back to a comment that I read you making a while back, where you said that a long-term Harvard study found that the single biggest factor in determining whether someone can escape poverty is not crime rates or elementary school test scores, but commuting time. Is this going to be now the argument that Uber is going to present to governments, not just in India, but around the world, to get them on board?
Well, I'm always worried when someone says, let me read back something you said. But in that case, I'm glad you did, because it's true that the number one reason that people stay trapped in poverty, and this is surprising a lot of people, is the cost and inaccessibility of transportation. So I think we have had challenges here in India, but we've had them all over the world. 2 years ago in the United States, we didn't have a single new law or regulation because this was a new thing and people didn't know how it fit in. Well, was it a taxi? What is this thing, and how do we account for it? So the reason I think you saw, there were some very, I think, positive central government guidelines that came out around ride-sharing here in India. We've had states here now move forward with new ride-sharing laws. All throughout the country this week, I've had just terrific conversations. And why is that? It's the value proposition. So I think in the beginning, people say, okay, there's this thing on an app, you can use it to get a phone, And in the beginning, a lot of young people like using it to get home from pubs, and that's an important use case. I'll talk about that. But does it go beyond that? So now when you say 250,000 people, even in a large country like India, in that short period of time, and we're going to add to that, that gets people's attention. So when you can say it's economic growth on scale, in India, that tends to be people doing it as their major source of income. In the US and China, it tends to be people who are doing it to supplement existing income. But in either case, I mean, I used to work in government. You wake up every day and you spend every day and you don't sleep at night because you're worried about there's not enough work for enough people. There's not enough income. Everywhere you go around the world, when you talk to people about their lives, what are the two things they say they'd like more of? Time and money. And we allow you to make money on your own schedule when you control the time. So I think it's the economic part of this. There's no doubt that whether it's Delhi or Bangalore or Hyderabad or Beijing or Los Angeles or London, congestion's getting worse and worse. There's more people coming into cities. The math is the math. The only thing that's going to give is we utilize our cars more efficiently, and ideally we get reductions in car ownership and usage. And we have a product here in Delhi now and in Bangalore, which is carpooling. So for those of you that have used Uber or are a competitor, now you can order a car and opt to share a ride with someone. And that is on scale something we think can bend the curve. And then there are profound, I think, safety impacts in terms of reduction of drunk and distracted driving. So I think for all those reasons, it's not an idea anymore. We can talk to people about, hey, if you enable ride sharing, here's what's on the other end of that. And
but it didn't start that way, right? It didn't start that way. You talked about this, that when Uber started in 2009, it was two guys who couldn't find a taxi cab in San Francisco. This business of supplementing income, about unemployment, none of this was part of the founding philosophy behind Uber.
No, and our founders are the first ones to tell you that they had no idea it would get this big. They had no idea that there was this big of a market. I don't think any of us realized that there was this hole in our transportation system. Right? That in many cases, regulations around limiting the number of taxis, it actually had a perverse impact. One, almost everyone in the world can drive. But by limiting the number of people who can make money doing it, you took that opportunity away. Secondly, it forced people in cities, and in suburbs certainly, to own cars, because they had no other way to get around. So in the beginning, of course, this was just a town car. It was just going to be a US product. But I think what's interesting as we get larger, and listen, we are a business, not a nonprofit. But there's no doubt that there's pretty important impacts, I think, for cities. And I think it's important because sometimes those that have strong views about us on the negative side will posit this as, well, okay, this is a choice between Uber and platforms like Uber and taxis. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is, Amit, from a business perspective, is not very interested in the taxi market. We're interested in, from a business standpoint, and we think this has positive societal benefits, cutting into the market of personal car use and ownership. That's where our growth comes. I think it surprises people to know that 50% of Uber trips around the world are one way. So people aren't using Uber for everything. They're using taxi, they're using Uber, they're biking, they're still using their personal car. We just become something that when it gets reliable, people say, no matter what time of day it is, no matter where I live, if I've got to get somewhere, I can press a button.
But just to pick up on the point that you made, that Uber is really about cutting down on personal car consumption in that sense. And this perhaps is giving auto car makers or automakers nightmares. In fact, Anand Mahindra, who heads Mahindra & Mahindra here in India, has said that one of the challenges that he foresees in the future is from companies like Uber, because you're going to come down and cut down personal car consumption. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, for instance, here in India, we're thrilled to have a partnership with Tata. Very important partnership. We have a good relationship with car manufacturers. So I think, first of all, listen, this isn't going to happen overnight. All these ride-sharing drivers need cars. By the way, one of the great things about our platform and others like it is a lot of the drivers default to more fuel-efficient vehicles. So you're replacing less fuel-efficient vehicles that are only used by one person and putting 18, 20, 24 people in a more fuel-efficient vehicle that cuts down on emissions. You know, rural areas, listen, it's not going to happen overnight. But at the end of the day, if we can get to a place where the other thing I'd say about lower income people is one of the big burdens on them is the cost of car ownership. They pay a particularly high burden, and many people are forced into that because it's the only way they can be mobile. So I think that you're still going to have a healthy car business. You look what's happening here in India, China. You know, there was even still big sales figures in the U.S. But there's no doubt that a world where we're more efficiently utilizing cars. You know, there's estimates that about 20% of the congestion in our cities is caused by people looking for parking. Think about that. If you can eliminate that, our cities are going to move a lot more freely. So, but I think overall, so in the U.S. we are starting to see, just to use a U.S. stat, about 10% of people under 30 have either given up a car or were going to buy one and now aren't going to buy one. So we're in our early years, but that's behavior change of a pretty significant standpoint. It doesn't mean people still aren't going to own cars. One of the big use cases is actually families going from 2 cars to 1 car. We see a lot of that around the world, even here in India. I've had many people this week mention that they've actually moved to that situation in their own family.
How different is the Indian market? And we were just talking about how in the US, for instance, it's not so much full-time that you've got people taking to Uber. In India, it is a full-time job in that sense. It's not transitional use. What does that mean then in terms of a business model for you here in India?
Well, I think on the driver's side, it tends to be based on the regulatory situation. So here, all of our drivers are licensed. They get yellow plates. By the way, the United Kingdom, a place that was open to competition from the very get-go, has a pretty high barrier to entry. So in London, our drivers are more like they are in India. New York City in the U.S., more like India and London than the rest of the U.S. So in the rest of the U.S., most of the laws say, hey, if you just have a Toyota Prius, you pass a background check, you have the right insurance, you can make a little money on the side. I think that's ultimately where we'd like to see more countries go, because that means there'll be more supply on the road, which make things like carpooling more likely to happen. And our vision is you don't even think about becoming an Uber driver. You just basically say, hey, I'm going to turn my car on, I'm going somewhere, I'll see if I can make a little money along the route. I think that would have profound impacts. But right now, here in India, because of the regulations and the system, you're going to have more people skewing full-time. It's also, every city's different. So obviously, there are cities in India that do have rail, intercity rail, others that don't. So in places that do have rail, about 20 to 30% of our trips end or begin at the end of the rail station. So we fill that last mile gap. But whether it's China, India, Africa, Latin America, Mexico, US, the core offering works everywhere, which is there's more people than anybody realized who are looking for a different way to get around, whether that's all the time or just a couple times a month. And there's more people than anybody realized who want to make money doing it. And so I think that's been a revelation. And again, when the company started, we had no idea, but that's where this is going. And you say, well, are we reaching saturation? No. Even in our most mature markets, even in San Francisco, California, there's a bunch of people that have never tried Uber. They're not sure what it is. So we still have a long way to go. And here in Delhi and in Bangalore, we have the core Uber offering, but we do have Uber Pool, which is carpooling. We want to bring that to every city in the world because we think it's good for drivers because they'll make more money because someone's always in the back seat. It's less expensive, which means we can bring that to more income ranges. But the congestion reduction benefits could be pretty profound.
From a policy point of view, because innovation is clearly far ahead of regulation at this point in time, and it's not just in India, but pretty much anywhere in the world. Is it important then to work with the government to try and get them on board? You've just signed an agreement with the Indian government, with the Labour Ministry, to sort of create micro-entrepreneurs. You're not the only one. I believe there's a bunch of other companies as well that are doing that. But is this going to be important for companies like Uber to engage with the government, to support the government, in order for them to actually get to buy into what you're hoping to do?
Well, that's our hope. And I think actually, so yeah, we just announced today we have a memorandum of understanding with the Labor Department. So right on the website for the central government, as people are searching for work, searching for income, that will be a suggestion. Come be a micro-entrepreneur and drive on the Uber platform. We have MOUs throughout the country with government. I'd say that we may have the closest ties here in India than anywhere around the world, because I think the government here has seen we've got a lot of people looking for work, whether they're unemployed. This is a great way to get them earning money, the dignity of work really quickly. So that's our hope, is that our conversations with governments are less about regulation, that gets settled, and it's more about, okay, how can we help? Whether it's transportation challenges, whether it's reduction of drunk driving. We partner with law enforcement agencies all around the world on reduction of drunk driving, whether it's on economic development, whether it's on job training and skills development. And a lot of Uber drivers, some of them are going to do this for 20 years. Some might only do it for a year. They're doing it as a bridge to something else. And I think that's another thing when we talk to people in government, they see the value of that. Because even if someone's doing it 40 hours a week, what's interesting, when we talk to drivers, and some of this is professional research, whether they drive 40 hours or 4. Flexibility is as important to the 40-hour one as the 4.
Yeah.
Because they say, if I want to take a class or I want to go to a doctor's appointment or I have a job interview, I don't have to ask anybody. I just turn the app off and I go do it. And I think in today's world, I mean, that's been a public policy goal of policymakers all around the world for several decades, is not only how do we create more work, but how do we create more flexible work? Because I think there is a price on flexibility.
You're talking about price and value, so I can't help but ask you about valuation. What is it, $65, $68 billion at this point in time? And you know, there's always shock and awe when you talk about valuations. Of course, Uber is the most valued startup at this point in time, and people are sort of amazed about the valuations of Indian startups as well at this point in time. But what do you make of this valuation game? I mean, there's criticism that private valuations are fake at this point in time.
Well, I mean, we're thrilled that there's so much confidence in what we're trying to do around the world from the investor community. But I think Amit would agree with us. We don't really focus much on that. I mean, we're just trying to run a good business. We've got a lot of expansion plans here in India and China, all over the world. So there's a lot of people around the world in cities that we haven't even begun to offer the service. We want to bring Uber pool places, so we're not really focused on that. I mean, I do think our business though is not speculative. It's not based on transactions that may happen down the road. Obviously, every ride is a transaction, and we're running a very, very sound business. We're obviously still in a growth phase in a lot of places around the world, including here in India. But we're thrilled. Obviously, the investment confidence that we've received allowed us to really scale and try and succeed here in India. The same thing in China. Something like Uber Pool might seem easy. It's not. It's incredibly expensive and complicated, the engineering and product talent we have to apply to that. So it's allowed us to invest in Uber Pool, in making the mapping and the core product offering better, and then to really compete in places where we have strong competition like India and China in as vigorous a way as we can.
So the reason for the surprise is that, these guys don't make anything, they don't own anything, and yet they're more valued than Ford, than GM, than Lockheed Martin, than P&G, for instance. How do you explain that? How do you respond to that?
Well, this is not really my area of expertise, but obviously, you look, Facebook, Google, things are a lot different than they were 25 years ago. So, I mean, what I think people see is we have the model succeeding. The model works everywhere. Everywhere. Cape Town, Cairo, Nairobi, Delhi, New York, it works everywhere. And, we're building a very powerful matrix. And in some parts of the world, we're starting to deliver food on demand, so you can get a sandwich or a salad in 5 minutes. We're delivering goods. So there's a lot you could potentially do with this platform. But the truth is, I don't think that any of the assessment of our business situation is speculative. It's just based on the core offering of moving people around cities.
So does it make sense then to go public anytime soon?
Listen, I think our CEO gets asked this almost every time he does an interview, and what he says is, don't hold your breath.
Okay, we're not holding ours. So let me end by asking you, in India, what kind of innovations can we expect given the regulatory climate and given the opportunity and the size of the market and the potential?
Well, again, I think...
And the competition.
Right. I think that, the central government guidelines that were released were very important. We see a lot of momentum here. I mean, as I've traveled around the country, I've been struck by when I've been meeting with governments. I mean, the reception has been wonderful. Focus on the value proposition. They want to know more about things like Uber Pool. So I think the real innovations will be, one, we've got obviously more cities here to bring the core offering to. We want to make services like Uber Pool work everywhere. We've actually got a product called Uber Commute, which is really interesting. So what that is, and I apologize, everything's Uber something. But what Uber Commute is if you're driving to work, to or from, you are an Uber driver just for that period of time. So it's a different financial arrangement to incent people to do it. But think about that. I mean, we all know when we drive into cities, we're often in the car by ourselves. The person to the left is by themselves. The person to the right is by themselves. What if you could get some percentage of those people using technology in an efficient way to share the ride? So I think you're going to see more innovations, more cities where we're going to offer this. There's most people in India, even who live in cities like Delhi and Bangalore, Hyderabad, aren't really familiar with Uber. haven't tried it. There's a lot of people out there that might be great potential drivers who don't know the opportunity. So I know we are, we're an interesting company and we're covered intensively. But the truth is, when you look at the general public, there's a lot of people out there, even in San Francisco, even in London, our earliest cities, that haven't tried Uber or haven't thought about driving. So we still have some real basic education to do with large segments of the population. But I think we're also doing a lot of innovation in safeties, and some of those have really been piloted here. So an in-app panic button, the ability to share your ride, any ride, with your friends and family members. That all started here in India. So we've got a big R&D department around safety. So we're going to continue to innovate in that space too.
So you've been here in India trying to get a sense of the country. What about the competition? Have you tried Ola yet?
I have not tried Ola. But listen, I think it's interesting. I mean, sometimes I'll be in a meeting with a government official somewhere, and they might joke that, well, I guess you used to take taxis. I'm like, what do you mean I used to? I still take taxis. Our CEO was here in Delhi and rode the bus, or I was in Mumbai. When I'm in New York City, I take the subway all the time. So, and I think that's a very important part, is we're just part of the fabric. So, and listen, one of the real benefits of our platform is a lot of our drivers in India drive, they have both Uber on their phone and Ola on their phone. And that's really important because obviously we love all those to be Uber rides, but if they get a ping and it's an Ola ride, they're going to go take that ride and they're going to make money, and that makes a happy driver. So that's really important. And that's the same thing in the US, same thing in China. And in some cases now, it's not just ride sharing. They'll have ride sharing, they'll have delivery. So they could have 4 or 5 apps on their phone. And whoever's got work for them at the moment, they're going to press the button and make some money. And so I think that's really important. So but competition's very healthy. Obviously, this has been a very competitive environment. We're thrilled that we're gaining market share. But we've got strong competition here and around the world. But I think it's important that we just are part of a transportation matrix. That this isn't a case where we believe everyone is going to be using Uber for everything. That's not realistic. Mm-hmm. But we fill a very important gap for a lot of people.
So let me end by quoting you back to you. The days of transport discrimination well and truly over, you believe? Or where are you in that journey?
I'm so excited by that. So all around the world, some of it is because of the happenstance of urban planning. There were transportation deserts that arose because of that. Many times it's low-income areas. I used to live in the city of Chicago, President Obama's hometown. The west side of Chicago, the south side of Chicago, primarily African-American, no cabs around there. And that's not a criticism of taxis. That just wasn't their model. They were in business districts around hotels. So it is so powerful. Say, no matter where you live, no matter what you look like, no matter what your last name is, you can press a button and have a car in 3 or 4 minutes just like anybody else in a city. And that's important economically, but it's also important, I think, from a value standpoint, because there has been transportation discrimination. Most of it just innocent, some of it malicious, but I think these platforms make that a thing of the past, and I think that's a wonderful thing to be celebrated.
David, on that note, thank you very much for joining us
Shereen.
here. Appreciate your time, and thanks very much for speaking to us. Thank you.